So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the first speaker. Can I just say, it's from Women's Hour last week, Friday, to our Centre for Agroecology seminar today. I'd like to introduce Dr. Geeta Luthra. Geeta is a lecturer in education at Brunel University and a South Asian woman over 50 with 2 grown-up daughters. Academic interests touch on women's studies and education, where she's interested in the intergenerational narratives of women of colour. Geeta also runs a social enterprise called Legitimacy CIC, which includes various components: intergenerational food and life stories, a women's writing programme, and monthly guided walks in the Chilterns. Geeta is passionate about diversity and representation of people of colour in relation to how they access and feel safe in and engage with natural landscapes. Geeta has led monthly guided walks since 2018 to encourage families to connect with nature for physical, mental and spiritual well-being. She's currently leading monthly walk and talk Sundays in the Chilterns, keen to develop enjoyment for all of these special green spaces. So in doing this work, she's interested in the healing of these walks as people of colour connect, share everyday stories and find peace and healing in the sacred space of nature. An absolute pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Geeta Luthra. Geeta, over to you.
Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction, Geraldine. And thank you to you and Coventry University. And also thank you I feel incredibly humbled to be speaking, with on the same platform as Pammy and Andre, who, are real incredible role models to people like me who are starting up. So thank you for inviting me in this space. So for me, I think one of the things that I've been looking at as a narrative researcher is how are we changing the narrative of the countryside? And I'm doing it in a really simple way, or I see it as simple. I'm simply walking, talking, and creating a safe space for Black, Indigenous people of colour to share our stories. And in saying that, I don't exclude white people or people who are not from this group, but my active presence as a brown woman means that I have attracted people who are from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. So the lens through which I speak today is as a brown community walk leader over 50, as Geraldine has just said. And I live in the Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty. And I have done for the last year. And recently as well, I've also become a Secretary of State DEFRA Children's Conservation Board member. And the slides will be uploaded and there's a link there for you to read more should you wish to. So in 2018, I set up Dadimas, which is the noun for grandmothers, the Hindi noun for grandmothers, monthly walk and talks around Virginia Waters and Windsor. And I did that because of, to support the loneliness agenda, to encourage families and communities to get together once a month. And I had received really positive feedback from that. I'm also bring an academic lens to my work as somebody who's worked in education for over 20 years and as a feminist narrative researcher. So I'm passionate and I'm really interested in local narratives and the narratives of people of colour, in particular in the countryside. How do we connect and how do we engage? So as I said at the start, I'm humbled to speak alongside Pammy and Andre, who have far more experience than me. So my presentation is a series of reflections, examples, and hopefully provocative questions that have got me thinking. Now, the countryside has always felt locked for me, locked not only for me, but for me and my family. I'm the daughter of a first-generation migrant family from India. I come from a working class background, and my upbringing was very much about survival and seeing my parents surviving and making a living. Self-care rituals or self-care leisure time never formed part of my upbringing narratives. Leisure time was never seen as a priority, but what was was becoming academically successful, doing the household chores whilst my parents were working in long hours in factories, and building that future security. Countryside nature walks were never part of our family life, but things like picnics in Nottingham Arboretum Park were. Knowledge of spaces to visit and what to do. What I feel, I mean, drawing on Bourdieu's notion of capital and reflecting on that, I don't know if there's anything theoretically on countryside capital, but I draw on Bourdieu here, and I don't feel that as a family, we had that countryside capital, even though my parents were brought up in the Punjab and lived in a village in India, where actually their connections with land were very much an embedded part of their life. But when they moved to the UK in this cold climate, that changed. We didn't have social networks that encouraged us to unlock these spaces. The countryside has always felt like a space for white people. And drawing on Nirmal Pawar's work about brown bodies and black bodies in white spaces, I always felt like a space invader who didn't belong. And even a year ago, when I moved to the Chilterns, I remember walking for many, many hours, not seeing a brown or black face and feeling physically and psychologically like an outsider. So let's turn it on the positive. What unlocked nature and countryside spaces for me? And I think these are just some of the areas. It was becoming a mother to 2 children, family UK holidays when I got married, and going to the Lake District, and that awe of seeing the beauty of the Lake District and thinking, I've never really travelled the UK, and there's so much beauty to be seen, and I want to see that. And experiencing the benefits, not only myself, but through my children. And I wanted to change the narrative for my family. And then as I grew up, I saw health inequalities within my extended family compared to my white friends and what their parents and families were doing in terms of camping holidays, countryside walks on the weekends and other things. And my family was very different. And as I've got older, particularly with some of the health issues I faced with burnout, menopause symptoms, it's rethinking how do I prioritize my health and my time and also become a role model for other people in my community. And I started to build my knowledge, my nature capital from scratch and wanted to become a role model. So I set up my own community network because I couldn't see myself in spaces to do with the countryside. So I thought, if I can't see myself, I'm going to do something myself. So the Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty, when I became a DEFRA board member, they were incredibly embracing of the voice and the lens that I bring to this very white space. And I've just shared on this slide here the focus and vision for Dadimas, which is a registered social enterprise. So I'm very much interested in connecting individuals, families, and communities, and sharing that knowledge and wisdom in a kind and positive way, and promoting good health and well-being in simple ways without this commodification of it. Because we are being sold self-care, well-being, in very marketable ways as well, and doing it through simple adventures. So I'm not somebody who's about to jump off the cliff or go wild camping at the moment. So I connect with nature in very simple ways. So walk and talk stories and feedback. Now I feel like I could write a little booklet on this already, but here's just a few examples of some of the feedback I've received. A lot of the people who have attended the walk will often WhatsApp me or email me after about how safe they felt on the walks. And people have come from the age of 8 up to grandmothers of 75. They have valued this dedicated monthly space where they have planned for the time to spend within this community. They've enjoyed meeting new people and building friendships and learning new knowledge and wisdom in this safe space. This co-identification, seeing other people like me. I've had women travel from Wolverhampton, Coventry, Nottingham, North London, because they've seen the walks on social media, and they've said it just looks and feels very different to some of the walks we've seen. So for example, somebody on my last walk, a grandmother, said, I've looked at Ramblers UK and other groups and yours look different. I thought I'll connect with other South Asian women. Other feedback that I've had is about the walking gear. Does it feel right? And it's this fear of looking out of place. So I've tried to share kind of snapshots without dictating what is cool to wear in the countryside. And if you look on social media, you can see why it can feel like quite an intimidating space. Am I fit enough and will I be left behind? There were two sisters who came to my walk and they said at the beginning that please, if we're not fit enough as the others, feel free to leave us behind. But that is very much not our philosophy. The healing benefits and the desire to return. So the women who have come on my walk and men, they have returned several times. And it's a safe space to share our cultural stories, our experiences, be they racialized, ethnic, gendered, and our migration stories. So does being a person of color matter as a walk leader if we are going to change the narrative? And I've thought about this so many times, and I say with conviction, yes, it does. And why does it matter? Because we are catalysts for change. Our brown and black bodies in traditionally white spaces are visible bodies. We become role models through our visibility. There is this sense of cultural co-identification. And I'm not just saying that through a theoretical lens, even though I am an academic, I have received this feedback. We have this shared understanding of marginalized communities and what it means to be marginalized. There is this power, there is this strength in sharing our collective lived experiences. I have my academic lens, obviously, and it's this sense of trust and safety. We are opening up conversations about, previously silenced taboo topics in our communities, be they menopause, be they about racism, be it about divorce and relationship issues. And we are facilitating, as people of colour, as walk leaders, we are facilitating the sharing of stories with respect, authority, and authenticity. And often that is rooted, particularly for me as a woman of colour and the daughter of first-generation migrants, in ancestral and historical understandings across geographies of spaces. So some of the challenges for me have been funding. I didn't know where to go to get funding. So we need support to apply and tell us that there is funding available. Knowledge. So I've used very much a common sense approach, if I'm being honest, but I don't have that expert in-depth training beyond self-taught and common sense, which somebody like Pammy, for example, offers. We need genuine allies, white allies, who are willing to give up power, to support and act, and offer us, I don't want to say a seat at the table because it almost sounds like we're begging for a space at this table, but they're willing to give up their privileged spaces to say, you need to be speaking here. It's your voice that is going to help us take positive action. Another challenge, and you could argue that this is a psychological challenge, is of safety. This fear of racism in traditionally white spaces. When I walk with this snake trail of brown and black bodies, and I'm there as the head of this snake or serpent, there is always this fear that what if somebody looks at me and says something that, you know, here you are taking up this space with these brown and black bodies, you know, this long trail. And, you know, you could argue it's psychological because I haven't had overt racism myself, but it's still there. And I've heard from other people and read about stories of racism. We need research and action with us and not being done on us. And if you go back to some of the, you know, original anthropological research, it was almost like it was done on us from afar through a white lens. but we need research, we need action where we are leading in positive ways. Where do we positively see ourselves as outdoor nature citizens across a range of social media platforms? Where are we presented and how are we represented or repackaged? On national boards, there is a wealth of research coming out about national boards and representation in these spaces. How are our voices and actions involved? And how do we see the countryside as a space that we genuinely belong in and we also feel safe in? I've had some really, really special moments and stories. I had a young girl who had a dog phobia, who wasn't connecting with the countryside for many, many years. And she talked about locking herself in the car because she was so fearful every time she came. One of the women, who's been an incredibly supportive white ally, bought her dog, and actually through the safety, through the group support, it was a really special and emotional moment where at the end of 3 of her walks, she actually brought herself to petting the dog. It's a non-judgmental space away from family pressures. There was a grandmother, one of the grandmothers in this picture here, who sang Hindu religious songs as a grandmother, and she shared them with other women on her walk. She made home-cooked Indian food on the morning of the walk, and she fed all of us as participants. I've invited expert speakers of colour who are positive role models. Dr. Anjana Katwa, who is leading as a South Asian woman and role model in this area. 10 of us as a group of South Asian women from our teenage years up to women over 50 walked for 4 hours in torrential rain. We were looking at becoming science citizens, where we talked about the butterfly count. There was a South Asian artist who talked about Mandela floor art. We talked about ancestral rituals in nature and tree stories and how our ancestral wisdom also matters. It's a different form of knowledge creation. We had a young gymnast, 11-year-old, a black girl doing gymnastics on the Chiltern Hills for enjoyment and fun. And some of us in our late 40s and over 50s were inspired not to do somersaults, but to do a few jumps. And she's now my young ambassador. We had a black woman sharing her camping love stories, and hopefully this will lead to a future adventure. And women who have come from afar, like Wolverhampton, Coventry, North London, who said, we're inspired to set up our own grandmother group. So I'm conscious that we change the narrative through positive lived experiences of the countryside. And we need to do that in a way that where we are leading those narratives. And here's one of the grandmothers who came on my recent walk, who made homemade Indian food, which opened up another dialogue in the Chiltern Hills. And all of these pictures and some of these captions of stories are on my Chiltern social media page. So final thoughts. Anita Setti's book, which I read recently, she talks about seeing walking as a form of activism. And actually for Mahatma Gandhi, it was. Do I see my walks as a form of activism? I think I do today. How do we appreciate and embed positive narratives of Black, Indigenous, people of colour into the white spaces of the countryside? How is research and action, and I know Pammy is going to talk about action after me, how is it being done with us, being led by us, so that our voices and bodies are central to the discussions? And when we look at countryside and nature spaces through race, culture, gender and class, through an intersectional lens, it actually provides us with a critical way forward without blurring the particular needs of individual groups. And I'm saying this, I recognize my own privilege as somebody who is able and as an academic also. And we need genuine allyship in these spaces beyond the EDI performativity of tick boxes. So if you want to contact me, there's some details on the slides there. I think I've gone 3 minutes over, so I apologize for that. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Geeta. Much food for thought. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. We have time, even though you've gone 3 minutes over, Geeta, for probably a couple of questions. Has anyone got any immediate questions, observations, points for clarification? We can take a couple now. Is there anything in the chat, Jazz? Okay.
Sorry,
okay then.
I'm on mute. Sorry. There's no questions in the chat, but a really useful article in the chat. Which
That's great. Thank you.
Question coming in. Sorry. It's from Ian Nutt. Ian, do you want me to read it out, or would you like to speak to that, Ian?
Hello. Sorry, I've just come off mute. I'm sorry. I'm in my my trackies. I was keeping the camera off, but I'll reveal myself instead. Geeta, that was really amazing to hear from you. Thank you. So I work just over the border from the Chilterns in South Oxfordshire for a charity that is a large landowner that is open, free public access to everybody. And I suppose there's that pitch, and we sometimes sit here, I think, especially as, and it's not me that owns the land, but obviously I'm a white man who works for a charity that is a landowner, a major landowner. And there's sometimes that reticence to understand how we ask for those leaders who are people of colour to come and do the leading on our land. And I'm just kind of really keen to know how we go about forging those relationships and partnerships that enable us to do that together.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, for raising that question. And when I moved into the Chiltern, so I back onto farmland, I was told some interesting stories about farmer engagement with local residents and people like me. It didn't deter me. I was also encouraged not to knock on the doors of farmers, but that didn't stop me. But I reached out and they reached back, and it was just beautiful how we've built that relationship already. So I think it's taking that first step and not being afraid to ask. I always think, what's the worst that someone can do is say, get lost. And that's okay. I'm all right with that. But I reach out, email people. They'll be really grateful. If people email me, I will always make time to reply. And I think the fact that you have asked the question is a really important way forward. So thank you for raising that. And I know that Elaine's got her hand up, and Elaine speaking through the lens of somebody who is working on a board might be able to add something different as you work with farmers in these spaces, Elaine.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thanks, Geeta. And yeah, I was one of those crazy women that was jumping in one of those slides. And, I'm feel very privileged to have met Geeta and been part of the walks and the work that we're doing to, improve access for everybody to the countryside. And I think, Ian, your question is a very good one. And from my point of view, it's about being a white ally, as Geeta described. And it is about reaching out. I mean, Geeta and I met by chance on Twitter through Anjana Katwa, and we took the conversation offline and have now become, friends and colleagues. And I think it's about having an open mind and being willing to just have those conversations, possibly making mistakes. I think a lot of people are a bit wary of how to couch it, what to say, so they don't do anything at all. But I think you've just got to show a bit of yourself, be authentic, and do what feels right. And I think as a white person, I have a responsibility to be that white ally. And as white people, we can show huge leadership, because I'm on a board with Geeta. We're a public body. We've got 27 members. Most of them are, white men of a certain age, which is, the case across boards of a lot of public bodies, particularly in protected landscapes. And they all know that this is an important issue. They all want to help, and they need to feel empowered to do that. And I think they do. And the fact that Geeta's been appointed to the board, shows that DEFRA, the government department that we are connected to, they feel this is a very important issue as well. But we can all be white allies, and we can create that space and show the leadership and be exemplars for other areas, really, and to show other people how we can do it. And it's great fun. I mean, Geeta and I, and all the other ladies and others that come out on the walks, and men too, we have such fun on the walks. So, you know, it doesn't need to be, we don't need to think of it as being part of our work per se, and just something that we know we have to do. It can be fun and hugely rewarding. So yeah, that's probably enough. But Geeta's been a game changer for me, and will be and is, you know, for our board. And we're really keen to just roll that out across other protected landscapes and show people what's really possible.
Thank you, Elaine. And I think also one of the other things is it's really important to encourage people to do the work. So sometimes we start, and Nova Reid, who's just written How to Be a White Ally, she talks about we have to do the work in order to be those genuine allies and move beyond the performative. And Pammy's written, you know, and I know Pammy, I'm not going to take airspace from Pammy, I'll let her talk about white allyship. And Joe, who talks about being a woman, experiencing life, menopause, sharing food. You know, I've got quite serious osteoporosis, and actually it was through one of my walks when another woman talked about bone health to me and how much research she'd done. I've been able to share that wisdom through my research of the menopause with other women on my walk. And that's not just women who are over 40, where we assume that's where the menopause happens, but actually, you know, girls in their 20s and 30s, like my daughters, saying, look after your bone health now. It's not just about how you look, you know, you look on the exterior, but it's really important as women of color, of people of color, we share particular narratives as insiders as well. So these spaces that are created through safety, through kindness, are really important. So I'm going to stop there, but I want to say thank you to everybody for your comments, and I'm sure more, you know, more creative conversations will be generated after Pammy now. So I will stop my video, Geraldine, and mute myself.
And yeah, definitely, hopefully, time for looking at these issues in more detail shortly. Thank you, Geeta. I think that was an amazing start to our seminar, and we'll move on now to our second speaker. And once again, excuse me, an absolute pleasure to introduce Andre Podonogwu to our Black History Month seminar today. Andre has over a decade of experience supporting youth-led action in communities in central London, grappling with the effects of systematic marginalisation. Last year, he made the move to Feedback Global, an environmental charity working to transform our food systems so it's good for the planet and its people. Today, he's going to explore where he sees some of the fertile ground for new linkages to be forged between the environmental sector and youth and community organisations serving Black and people of colour and their communities. So welcome, Andre, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Geraldine. And yeah, thanks, Geeta. There was a lot to think about there for me as well, and I think some parallels with some of the points that I'll touch on now. Maybe just to say, you know, I'm here primarily as a practitioner, youth work practitioner, historically, and now as head of activism at Feedback, I'm seeking to use that kind of knowledge and experience in service of the environmental movement and young people. And so what I'd really like to do is just share some thoughts at the moment in the hope of cultivating some conversation. And yeah, I hope that there's as much for me to learn from the group here as you guys might learn from me. So I probably want to start from, yeah, I'd like to depart from the perspective that the patterns of racial exclusion from nature, they're not just an expression of kind of the wrong-headedness of our times. They're part of a broader racial regime of access and exclusion, and one that's productive. I think the work of Cedric Robinson has been really helpful for me in thinking about this, and his work on racial capitalism. Yeah, these are patterns which are not just there because of some nefarious faceless evildoers who believe the wrong thing. These things produce some of the foundations of our society, and so while I'm going to try and explore that a little bit, and I'm cautious to try and like retroactively package up history into like very simple binaries, but I think there's two words that are really at the core of what I want to talk about here: enclosure and escape. And enclosure, the act of kind of capturing, cornering, defining possibilities, and kind of shaping infrastructure systems and knowledge in line with those enclosures, and escape, the work of evasion, of trying to escape that perhaps overly prescriptive understanding and the effects that it wreaks on individual lives and individual trajectories. And I think these two dynamics are really helpful lenses, I think, to when we think about people of colour and the environment in the UK. So like, how do we talk about this? How do we talk about enclosure? Like, there's been a lot of rhetoric about the lack of social mobility in the UK. Most recently, there's kind of talk about the need to level up the north. And whatever the language that you kind of choose, I think it's important to try and translate that into how that's experienced, how that's felt. And for the young people that I've worked with, I've mainly interpreted it as a sense of being trapped, of feeling cornered, and feeling like there are forces that you can't see or feel working against you. And I think what I find quite interesting is that you can track that feeling within our individual stories. And my parents migrated here, and to a sense, there might have been more optimism kind of combined in their perspective at that point when they were making those big journeys and those big changes. But there was a sense, of some enclosure. There's a fixed set of possibilities that didn't align with their individual beliefs or understanding of what they were capable of or what they deserved. And so they moved from peri-urban and from rural backgrounds to a city, and London, across oceans and continents. And I think, if we think about that, like enclosure and escape, they've been here. They've been a part of Black people and people of colour's lives, and their history in, if you wanted to go back to transatlantic slavery and maroon communities who escaped slavery and managed to set up independent communities in, removed to try and define their own capabilities. You could talk about, again, drawing on Cedric Robinson's kind of work on Haiti and looking at the slave rebellion there, and that passion, that joy of life that forces people to seek out new possibility, new potentials. I think there's a lot of power in that dynamic. What feels unique about the here and now is the extent to which Black Britishness feels enclosed within urban geographies. Like the link is so strong that, like, urban has at points been used as a crude euphemism for Blackness. Urban music, and it's not been used for a little while, but any fans of Dizzy Rascal out there will other of his contemporaries will recognize that term. And I think, like, that enclosure is something that we really need to grapple with now. There's this sense that actually within the urban landscapes, you have a set of possibilities, a set of limitations, which are often enclosed as, the definition of Blackness. And people are then kind of locked in trying to resist that, or trying to, prove that they do not belong to that category, belong to that group. And I think this is, the mechanism by which patterns of access and exclusion are productive. They create this disposable group of people who can be subject to exploitative labor practices, and then kind of run alongside that where you have subgroups within those communities who are able to function within the economy as in the mainstream, you have this kind of punitive example of why you don't want to be that, and that propels you along this professionalized route to being a part of the main system. And I think, you know, for me, what strikes me is the extent that flight, escape is no longer a possibility. It's kind of choose what form of fight you take, and whether that's kind of, you know, for the young people who are involved in the informal economy, whether it's choosing to fight that by taking alternative means to achieve the aims that society says you should be pursuing, whether or not it's, you know, fighting hard against the disproportionality that exists within the mainstream system to still go to university and work hard to try and secure a job, to push through glass ceilings, et cetera, et cetera. It's fight or fight. And I think that's really problematic. So, sorry, I'm just trying to find my own. So what's this relationship between like kind of urban enclosure and nature? Well, I think it intensifies those processes. It intensifies the pressure that people of color are feeling in cities, in urban environments, to either comply or find alternative forms of resistance that ultimately, yeah, can be incredibly difficult. Sometimes they are not always aligned with a broader vision. Sometimes they are, but they feel disconnected, isolated, you know, that kind of feeling that individuals are struggling alone. And I think this kind of propensity to continue to invest in urban solutions to urban problems is really problematic. In thinking about like ways then that we could address this, like what opportunities, where is there fertile ground then for collaboration? I think this is kind of reveals one of the key elements, you know, beginning to divest to provide opportunity for escape for people of color within nature. And, you know, I've worked for 6 years, I worked for an organization based in Camden, and the youth violence epidemic was really heating up. And for me, came when an individual had lost their life, sadly, down to youth violence. And somehow young people in the area had heard, just through their own networks, through young people who've been on our programs, that we had t-shirt making equipment in the organization. And kind of out of nowhere, kind of 10, 12 young people rocked up and asked us if we could support them to fundraise for their friend's funeral. And it really struck me, kind of, we were there till midnight, I think, one night, and then there till late again the second. These young people kind of formed this like factory line, you know, each one with their stage kind of talking. And it struck me that that work that they were doing wasn't just about fundraising. It was about processing grief. It was about trying to move through this kind of incident that had really rocked them, had shook them to the core. And, you know, where society has kind of got structures for dealing with loss, you know, within the family. You know, there are things that happen automatically for friends, and sometimes that can feel a little bit more unclear. And what they found in that space was a moment to really just be together and feel like they were working, like they were regaining some agency in a situation that was quite horrific. And I think it strikes me that we need to be asking the question, where do some of these interventions need to take place? You know, where can a young person best process their grief? Is it on the streets that they've lost their friends in the neighborhood, where perhaps there may still be risk? Or is it amongst nature, where there's space to fully experience their vulnerability and move through it? to really connect with their peers. For young people who are excluded from the education system, do we continue to, increase the carceral nature of their education to try and get them to conform to work that frankly is going to be out of reach for them? And kind of everybody in those spaces, I think, feels that. Or do we help them, experience other environments where there are other potentialities that make use of their skills? There are so many facets, I think, of the solutions that we're deploying in urban areas, which only serve to increase the intensity of that urban enclosure, when really we should be trying to break free of them. These are tricky things. These are not things that are going to happen overnight. These will take deep relationships to be formed and a deep sense of trust. I think the main thing at the moment is to commit, is to identify that there's these possibilities and begin to work towards them. And I think there are a number of really key benefits that the environmental sector could potentially realize from this. Firstly, I get the sense sometimes this is a kind of fledgling thought. So yeah, I'd like to express it, and I'm also open to it being challenged and it being the subject of conversation. But I get the sense within the environmental sector that there is a sense of frustration that the working class people of our country don't seem to care about the environment. There's almost like a sense of the sector has given up. And I think in some ways it can really fuel something which is really positive in our support for Indigenous and people in the Americas and the Global South. But I think at its heart, sometimes it can feel like actually that's where hope lies, and there is no hope here. And I think that's really challenging. Really, first of all, it feels like there's this perpetual risk that the word Indigenous gets misinterpreted within the confines of our own societal understanding. That instead instead of understanding that what Indigenous people are challenging is the right to plurality and the authenticity that comes with that sense of connection to land, to place, and the authority to decide what systems exist and what don't. There's a lot packed into that word, but I think actually when it lands over here, it can actually serve to reinforce a very parochial understanding of what the British countryside is, and connect it to this idea of Englishness or Indigenous Britishness, which I think reinforces the wrong facets of what we should be pursuing here, and in fact endangers us further entrenching those racial disparities in access to nature. And I think another side of this is I also get the sense that there is a real crisis of legitimacy between progressive actors in the UK and marginalized communities. There's rebellion everywhere you look, from the Brexit vote I won't go into it, but I think there is a sense as well that kind of social contract that says that these people are the bastions of what's good and what's true, and so we afford them a position of leadership, then is kind of perhaps it has been eroded, and there's something that needs to be rebuilt there. And I think aligning our work to make sure that there is mutual interest at the heart of it has a lot of potential to reinvigorate some of those bonds and that trust. And lastly, I think in grappling with who gets to access land, I think we begin to approach a key question, which is about the concept of commons in this country. And I think we've gone to a point now where it feels like the argument about whether or not climate change is happening has been won. And now the question is, how do we address it? And I think there is a risk, and this is borne out in conversations about the just transition, that we end up actually fortifying some of the actors who have already wreaked devastation on our ecologies and on our people via their extractive practices. And in order to really challenge that, we need to challenge ownership and ownership structures. And you know, our concept of commons in the UK has taken a battering, whether it's from social housing, whether it's from community space, or indeed access to land. And I think by building in people who are marginalized, who have differing needs than just kind of either the ornamental appreciation of nature, or you know, the commodification of it and the extraction of value from it, begins, I think, to reinvigorate that conversation, that discussion, and get us back on track to thinking about actually what's the shape of the British countryside and access to it. I'll probably stop waffling on there. Thank you for listening. It's been great to just kind of talk, and yeah, I look forward to receiving comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Andre. Another great presentation, raising a lot of food for thought. We've got time to take one possible question, point of clarification for Andre before we move on to our final speaker. Have we got any hands up? Have we got anything in the chat, Jazz?
Yeah, we've got lots of comments in the chat, but I'm trying to work out if there's a question. So just give me 2 seconds, Geraldine.
No problem. If anyone wants to ask a question at this point, if you use the hand raised facility, we can take it now.
There is a slide question from Ian Nutt again, around, shall I try and speak to that, Ian, or would you?
Yeah, please do.
So there's a comment by Ian, says, Andre, really interesting point. I might suggest that it's not limited to race or urbanism, but possibly between landowners and the historical context of who owns land in the UK and what its use is. I don't know if you want to make a comment to that, Andre.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the perpetual challenge of the UK context, which is that we do have race overlapping with, you know, deeply held and historic class processes. And so it's always difficult. But I think the standpoint I always adopt is that, you know, a class or a purely economic resolution will not in and of itself resolve the race tendencies. And so the race tension, sorry. And so, you know, we could, you know, theoretically speaking, see a new kind of resolution which addressed working class access to land, but it would not per se address the access of Black and people of color to that land. And I think the risk is that if, you know, and this is where kind of I was going with the notion of indigenous, like how does that get received within British culture? You know, if we're not careful, what we end up doing is kind of fueling a kind of, you know, the basis for an eco-fascism, you know, the sort that Anders Breivik was kind of espousing before he committed his atrocities, where working class people are connected to British land by British history and to the exclusion of all else. Actually, I think what we need to be pushing towards really is a new progressive kind of settlement and a reinvigoration of cultural production in the countryside, not a renaissance, an enlightenment where new cultures and peoples from across the world who share much of British culture, but also bring in different elements from their own backgrounds to create something new, which is important. And I think there is this kind of progressive and ambitious aspect which engagement with race and the countryside can bring about, that dealing with just class cannot. Yeah, I'll probably leave it there.
You're on mute, Geraldine.
I just realised. Thank you, Andre, and I'm sure we'll pick up some of these points in the discussion in a short while. I'm going to move swiftly on. Last but by no means least, our final contributor is Pammy Joel. Pammy is the founder and operation director of Backbone, celebrating diversity through adventure, a community interest company. It was founded in 1995 and formally incorporated in 2011. Pammy has been an outdoor education practitioner since 1979. Pammy holds a BA in recreational studies, specialising in outdoor education and community development, and is regarded as an expert in the field for engaging Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities in the great outdoors. She's passionate about discovery and journeys in remote wilderness areas of the world, be that on a bike, skiing, foot, dog sled, or whatever else is thrown at her. She currently lives in the middle of nowhere in the northwest islands of Scotland. One of Pammy's key messages in the making of Backbone is to understand where we are going, we must first get to grips with our past. And it is my past that is the making of Backbone. So as an outdoor environmental practitioner since 1979, in 1995, it struck her hard as she noticed the lack of Black, Asian and minority ethnic role models in the outdoor environmental sector at every level, from service users to board level, and felt very strongly this had to change. In 1995, then, she laid the foundation for what is now Backbone. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce you and for you to contribute today, Pammy, and no further ado, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Geraldine. And well, you know, it's going to be quite interesting following on from Geeta and Andre, some really interesting thoughts. So thank you everybody, and thank you all, because you're going to have to listen to me for the next 10-15 minutes. Ha 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 ha. So the joke is on you, really. So a little bit about it's really I want you to be able to talk to me through chat, because the way I work and deliver these webinars is I will make some quite provocative and challenging comments, and I'm hoping that you will kind of put some stuff in that little chat that will kind of challenge me back a little bit. So Geraldine's done a wonderful introduction with regards to who we are and what we do. Backbone celebrates diversity through adventure, and what that means is that we recognise that adventure for some people is just leaving their front door, going for a walk in the park, driving along a single track road, and for some of us it may be climbing a huge peak or cycling across the world or whatever. But we recognise that adventure means different things for different people depending on what we've experienced and where we are at. And I think that fits in quite nicely with what Andre and Geeta were saying with regards to the people and the communities that they work with and where people are at and the opportunities that they've had to experience something different. Our main thing is not only to offer experiences, but we actually develop role models in the community, role models in the great outdoors that are qualified and experienced and have the knowledge and the confidence and the competence to take their own groups out, set up their own groups, or go and work for the sector or not. So the way I'm going to run this 15 minutes is you're going to have to look at me, and you've had to look at Andre. Geeta got away with it with a few slides, but the bottom line is I want you to have a good hard look at me, because I am a person of colour and I have been working in the sector for over 40 years. And my experience as a professional is the foundation of why Backbone exists, but also the foundation of where our hope is the sector is going to go in regards to engaging with ethnically diverse members. I'm also going to be quite challenging. Really what I wanted to call this piece was, the question I wanted to ask is the sector institutionally racist? Ooh, that's a kind of a scary word to say, isn't it? But let's get real. So the kind of approach I'm going to use in the next 10 minutes, I want it to be tangible and I want it to be real. So we can talk and we can talk. We can have abstract thinking. We can have models. We can have research. But the bottom line is, fact of the matter is, the outdoor sector lacks ethnic diversity, and it has lacked ethnic diversity for over 40 years. And something drastic and real and tangible needs to happen if we are going to shift this reality. And it's great because on a participation level, it is shifting. There are folks out there that are saying, that are owning the countryside and owning the environment. And Andre, you were saying that, you know, that kind of, we're stuck in that urban area. That's changing, and it's really fantastic to see and feel. However, it's happening on a participation level. And again, I can't remember whether it was Gita or whether it was Andre that said it, but, you know, we need to take ownership of structures to be able to influence those structures so that we can become more inclusive and take ownership of nature. So one of the key things that isn't happening in the sector is we still have got lack of ethnic diversity in employment, in those staffing roles, in those volunteering roles, and in those board level senior positions. And I'm not talking tokenistic roles. I'm on about roles that can influence and have the power to change things. And right now, there is a lot of tokenistic stuff going on out there that needs to be challenged. So, where am I going with this? So, we've just run thank you, Geraldine, for putting the link on with regards to the outcomes of a symposium that was a process, not a moment. And that symposium was called Changing Landscapes, Actioning Change. Before I go on to the findings of, or the outcomes really, I just want to look at the key outcomes, not necessarily the entire findings of that report. I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic, I'm a doer. So my perspective is going to come from a doer that has experiences with real groups and the sector, both positive and negative. But where did this all come from, this symposium idea? I've been in the industry for 40 years. We've been developing role models. We've been doing, we basically said the sector isn't working for me, so let's go on and do with backbone. I wrote this as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement last year, recognising that I've been doing this for 40 years. And I wrote it on Facebook, on social media and all that stuff. I'm not very good at social media, but I decided to do this anyway. So here's what I wrote. Celebrating diversity. Are we? I have been asking this question of the outdoor education and environmental sector for over 40 years, and the very reason I founded Backbone. I am the operations director at Backbone, an experienced and qualified outdoor education practitioner, my chosen profession since 1979. I deliberately use the words experienced and qualified as they are the credentials that are highly regarded in our profession. However, for me, that has not always been the case. I am going to share some experiences of my time in the sector so that we may learn from our past. I will never hire one of you again. These are all real experiences that I experienced pre me setting up Backbone. And this was when I was late for work. Admittedly, I'd gone climbing and I shouldn't have been late. But that language, I will never hire one of you again. This is the feedback that I got from a job interview from a leading outdoor development training organisation in Britain. I went for an interview and their feedback to me was, you are like a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. I asked for clarity, and to this day, I have not had that clarity. I could have taken them to the cleaners, by the way. legally, but chose to use that energy to set up Backbone instead. I also managed, again for a leading outdoor development organisation, I set up the very first developing trainers in the Black community training programme, a year-long programme targeting ethnic minority members to become leaders in the great outdoors. It was really successful, the first one in the UK. And in my appraisal, one of the first things I got asked by my supervisor was, how do we know it wasn't just a group of your mates having fun? So my response was, I gave them the written report and I said, cheerio, and walked out, and I wouldn't work with that organisation again. And the last one, which I find quite amusing, I went for an interview at an outdoor organisation, and the interviewer, a white male, asked me what was my understanding of Asian women. And at that point, I just said, well, actually, I don't think I want the job, and walked away. So all these have happened since prior to me setting up Backbone. However, have those things changed? Fortunate for me, those incidences gave me the driving force to set up Backbone, and we've been going since 1979, really, if I'm honest. So these experiences are one of the driving forces behind us setting up Backbone. And we set up Backbone to directly remove inequalities, allowing everyone access to the great outdoors and all that it has to offer. A place where people could come together and celebrate in their uniqueness and share commonalities. Triggered by the Black Lives Matter movement, I continue to ask the question, has our sector learnt from the past? And I'm using Backbone is part of the sector. We are a sector organisation, an outdoor organisation, and we are a Black, Asian and ethnic group, a community group, because we work with both. We have our foot in both camps. So in my job as a founder and director of Backbone, I continue to be disturbed by some of the most recent experiences of inequalities. We, on Saturday, have got a huge event. 150 refugee and asylum seekers are coming to the National Park here in Scotland, and we deliver what we call our Outdoor Festival for All. And we've been delivering these for years. But this year's, I have had more challenging conversations with the sector and spent more energy with sector organisations managing their, what I call, cattle market approach to gathering EDI stats, imagery, quotes, trying to get development plans, whatever it is, consultation moments. And yet, the group that we have got coming on Saturday, the 120, 150 people we have coming on Saturday, majority of those folks cannot speak English, let alone understand the complexities of setting up a development plan. Their main focus is meeting each other and experiencing nature. It's not about being there to tick the right box. So we have initiated those conversations, and they're challenging conversations. But the point I'm making is that it's a BME organisation that has to challenge sector organisations. That needs to change. And that's the reason that we delivered the symposium this year. A challenging process, challenging outcomes, but we need action. So that's what happened. We had the symposium, we wrote the report. I'm not going to tell you how we did it because you can find that on the report, but I want to just focus on key outcomes of what I have labelled, and I've taken the privilege of doing that. I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to call it excuses for inactivity. And we are part of that process. So, whatever's going on out there, we see ourselves as part of that. But we have to start to tip things on the head a little bit. And I think it was Ian from the Earth Trust earlier on. You said, what can we do about this? You have a responsibility. The sector has a responsibility as a service industry to reach out to ethnically diverse communities. It is not the other way round. Up until now, it has been the ethnic groups and members that have been reaching out, climbing a mountain to come and find out what the services are that are out there to do with the environment, to do with the countryside. How do I access the countryside? Some folks can't read English and they're still finding you. They are still finding you and they are still reaching out to you. So what is it that the sector is not doing? That means that we have still got such a low percentage of folks that are participating, that are volunteering, that are not taking your jobs and that are not taking your positions. Right now, there is a huge energy and resources going into let's get more folks from different backgrounds and abilities to utilise the great outdoors. It is still loaded. It is still loaded because there is still funding attached to it, which could mean that people are doing it not for the right reasons, but to attract funding. And it puts the additional pressure on those organisations to start having to chase up these numbers. Hence, 120 people from a minority group coming to one place on Saturday, and we are being chased by the senior teams of organisations to capture those numbers. That's not genuine intention. So let's see what we can do about it. So what we came up with was what I called excuses for inactivity. So I'm just going to list them and read them, and I'm hoping you're going to challenge me afterwards, particularly sector organisations that are sitting there, actually, and community groups, because the excuses for inactivity belong in both camps, both community groups and sector organisations. So the first one is what I call repetitive research syndrome, and you academics sitting in there are going to hate me, because I think what a waste of flaming money, man. Because when you walk into any outdoor organisation, you don't need research to tell you that you are lacking people from ethnic diverse communities that are working for you, that are volunteering for you. And even actually, it's only recent that we have even started participating and utilising your services. So we don't need research to tell us that. Yet there are massive amounts of resources that are being spent on what I call repetitive research syndrome. And you know what happened when I first entered the industry way back in the 90s, and Humberstone in 1999 said the following, and I bet you're probably going to say, well, this still applies today, doesn't it? We all need to continue to critically reflect upon our practices and attempt to ensure that what we provide and how we provide it is underpinned by an understanding of and respect for others who may not fit the white middle-class able-bodied male mould. That was in 1999. I think that still applies today. Do you? So repetitive research syndrome, use that money to do action as opposed to research. Myth and reality of equality and diversity and inclusion training. There. I bet all of you are doing that, aren't we? Well, and it stops there. A lot of the sector organisations, we stop at providing EDI training. Again, resources are spent on what we call boardroom style delivery of EDI training, and we stop at unconscious bias. Therefore, it's okay for me not to understand. It's not okay. Something else needs to happen, and something else needs to happen is action on the ground with groups. Lack of Asian, Black and ethnic role models in the sector. Let's pull down money that really does go towards training people in the great outdoors, which is what we do, and we do really well in Scotland. We have got loads of role models out there that we have trained our alumni that are owning their own projects, delivering their own projects for their own communities back in Scotland. Let's use those role models and grab that talent. Why isn't the sector grabbing that talent that is out there? Trained, not trained, because there are groups out there that are doing it for themselves. So the sector, I'm asking us, why have we not grabbed that talent? I'm actually going to take us out of that equation, because we've created some of that talent and we are grabbing that talent and we are paying them, and they have jobs and they are real, and we can see those staff members and we can see the impact that they're having. So that's tangible and that is real. The other one is both for community groups and for sector organisation, there is a lack of confidence, knowledge and access to each other. And both parties lack that confidence, knowledge and access. However, the service industry, which is the sector organisations, you are providing a service. It is your responsibility to find the confidence and to find those folks that want to use your services. So there is more weighting on the sector than there is on community groups. There are gatekeepers to opportunities, excuses for inactivity. So we have a lot of member organisations in the sector, and those member organisations, including those that are in senior roles in those organisations, do not want to see Black, Asian and minority ethnic members, and they do not want to see them in those jobs. Because the bottom line is racism exists in the external world. You have membership bodies, you have members of the public that are racist, that sit on your boards and that do take on roles that stop people that do not look like themselves from entering that organisation. The same happens with BME groups, with Black, Asian and ethnic community members. They are gatekeepers to opportunities. So opportunities go to leaders, and the leaders have decided either to keep it for themselves or they've decided to give it to their family members and not spread the word to the wider community. And then there is all that unprofessional, unethical behaviour, practices and policies. And that goes to what I'm experiencing to do with the event this weekend is folks want to take photographs. Folks want to, we have had folks write letters of support for us so that they could immediately send it so they can get funding. We have had folks tag us on Twitter and on Facebook to events that we have had nothing to do with us. We have had folks utilise the groups that we have spent years creating relationships with and just grab their numbers. So there's lots of unethical behaviours. If it is not backed by a strategic approach to ethnicity and diversity in your organisation, and it is not backed by prioritising that and by prioritising funding towards it, it is not genuine. So do not go chasing after photographs and quotes and imagery that is not backed by a strategic approach that is tangible and real. So I've kind of gone on a little bit really, and I have been quite kind of jumpy a little bit, but I hope I've kind of stirred you into giving me a bit of jive back. So I'll end it just there.